Hello, everyone. My name is Dadisi Sanyika, and I am the board chair of the Continuous Delivery Foundation. I am here today with Nathen Harvey, who is the group leader for the DORA Metrics program in Google. Nathen, should let you introduce yourself. Yeah, go right ahead.
All right, great. Well, first, thanks so much for having me at Dadisi. It's good to see you again. And hi, everyone. My name is Nathen Harvey. As Dadisi was saying, I lead up DORA at Google Cloud. Now, Dadisi said the DORA Metrics program, but it's more than just metrics, of course. DORA is a whole research program that's been running for over a decade now. And the goal of the research really is to understand how do we build and sustain high-performing technology-driven teams. And of course, in order to answer that question, we're going to need some metrics, but we're also going to need some research that shows us what sort of capabilities and conditions do you need within your teams, within your organizations, and within your systems in order to achieve that high performance.
So, how did you go about figuring out what metrics or what things to research to kind of lead to these metrics? I mean, how did that process begin?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say that the process there kind of, at least in terms of the software delivery metrics, kind of predates my direct involvement with DORA, but I've been at least loosely involved since almost the beginning. So I have a good bit of background on that. Really, the researchers that started this, and it was started, like I said, over a decade ago. It actually started out of Puppet Labs, and a researcher named Dr. Nicole Forsgren joined the effort. Jez Humble, Gene Kim, all were part of the early days of this DORA research. And they were really trying to understand kind of two things. One, does software delivery performance matter? And if so, to whom, right? And so they wanted to see, how does software delivery performance impact things like organizational performance and well-being for people in the organization, things along those lines. In order to do that, they needed a way to measure software delivery performance. And, you know, our industry is full of metrics of all kinds. We're always measuring something, right? We're engineers. We want to measure everything and we want to have precise measurements for everything. But how do you measure software delivery performance and why software delivery? So maybe start with why software delivery. Look, when this research started, Agile was definitely in place in many different organizations and had been for quite some time. And so I think just thinking about that time when Agile was first coming out, we were heavily focused on how do we help developers create better, faster software. But there was this real challenge in organizations in terms of once you've created the software, how do you actually get it in front of users? Because frankly, the software that runs on my laptop or the DC on your laptop, like it's not very valuable to our organizations. It might be valuable to you or to me, but it doesn't really provide any value to our customers. Well, except those customers that you can get to gather around your laptop and interact with the application that you built. But hopefully your organization is at a slightly larger scale than that. So organizationally, there was all of this friction between we wrote all this software, now we want to ship it to customers and get it out there. And boy, there were lots of challenges. And unfortunately, today in many organizations, there still are lots of challenges. But, software that's not been shipped is almost a liability, right? You can think of it as inventory that's sitting on your shelves. No one can get any value from it. It's a liability on your books. You want to get it out there so that you can start to recognize that value. So this was where they kind of focused the research on that software delivery process. But how do you measure that? Well, the easy answer is speed. How quickly can you ship things, right?
Right.
And that's a good measure, but it's not telling the whole story because moving fast is great unless what you're doing is breaking things all the time. So move fast and break things. How about move fast and don't break things? That sounds better, right? And so to that end, they kind of said, all right, we need to measure two high-level concepts, the throughput of changes and the stability of those changes. So for throughput, they devised two metrics. One was change lead time. And this really asks, how long does it take for a change to go from committed in the version control system all the
Mhm,
way through
mhm,
to in front of customers, where a user can interact with it in production? So that's
mhm.
our change lead time. And then how frequently are you making those changes? So what's your deployment frequency? How frequently are you shipping changes to production? Those two measures are our throughput measures. And then you flip over to the stability side, because again, we want to move fast, but we don't want to break things all the time. The first metric that we have on the stability side is what's called the change failure rate.
Mhm.
Now, the change failure rate is really a measure of like, let's look at all of the deployments that you've done over a period of time. Let's say in the last year, how many deployments have you done? And of those deployments, how many of those caused what I call an oh expletive moment? You know those moments, Dadisi. You push a change to production and you or someone around you shouts out an expletive. Why? Because, uh-oh, we shouldn't have done that. Like we've got to roll that change back or we've got to put
Yes.
a hot fix. Something unexpected happened. And not only was it unexpected, but we need to take immediate action. So things like, oh, I pushed out a change. It had a known bug. Unfortunately, we still ship software today
Yeah.
with known issues, known bugs. Like it's fine.
Yep.
We'll fix it on the next release, right? That's not a change failure. But when you push something and you have to remediate it, fix it immediately, that is a change failure. So we look at a change failure rate as like the percentage of those deployments that were fails.
Okay.
And then the final metric is the time to restore service. So when you push something to production, how long does it take you to recover that service after those oh expletive moments and get things back to working? Now, a couple of things about those metrics. First, if you think about those four metrics, right, those two for throughput, two for stability, you can apply them to any type of technology that you're delivering, whether you're working on a mainframe application, a mobile application, your company's, static website, you can
Mhm.
use those metrics to measure them. Of course, you should expect very different results depending on your context, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. But it's also really important that when we think about those metrics, we think about them holistically and across an entire application or service. And holistically, meaning anyone that's responsible for that application or service has to take accountability for those metrics, right? We don't want to be in the sort of the state that we were when this research began, where we turned to developers and we said, throughput, that's your job. Make things go as fast as you can. And then we turned to operators and we said, stability, that's your job. Make sure nothing breaks. And coming
Yes.
as
Yes.
coming out of a history as an operator, a system administrator, I knew the
Mhm.
best way to keep my system stable. I accept no changes. Nope, we can't ship
Yeah.
anything. If we don't change anything, things will continue to work.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that mindset, like you take it a step further and you really want your systems to never fail, make sure your customers aren't using them either, because that's the only way to make sure that they don't change, right? So we can't be in that world. We have to have joint ownership of those four metrics. And then the other thing I think that's interesting about those four metrics is over time, over the decade that we've been researching them, they've morphed a little bit, like they've changed a little bit. And a good example of how things changed in the beginning times, we asked, how long does it take you to recover from an outage? Well, it turns out that maybe that's not the best measure of something. We're not really getting at the signal that we want. I'll give you a great example. An outage can happen in, well, I don't know, an infinite number of ways you can cause an
Yes.
outage. One way that you might cause an outage, let's say you're deploying things to your to a data center, a backhoe could come and cut power to that data center. Whoopsies, that is definitely an oh expletive moment, right? You're going to
Yep.
have to recover from that. How long is that going to take? It might take quite a bit of time.
Yep.
Another type of outage, you have a firewall configuration file and you update that configuration file and there's a typo in that configuration file. Now your firewall is not doing what you expect. How long is it going to take you to fix that? These are very different classes of outages, if you will. And you should obviously expect the time that it takes to recover and the effort that it takes to recover those to be very different. So
Yep.
a few years ago, we changed that time to restore to a failed deployment recovery time, which does two things. First, it kind of tightens the scope of what type of failures are we talking about? We're talking about delivery failures or deployment failures that we want to recover from. And then second, it sort of moves that metric closer in keeping with the spirit of software delivery metrics. Now,
Right.
look, if a backhoe comes and cut power to your data center, you're gonna probably have to ship some software in order to get out of that. But
Yep.
that's not the typical sort of software delivery thing that you think about. So those are kind of the four metrics that we've landed on, throughput and stability being the high level categories. And in fact, in 2024, we introduced another one on the stability side. And the reason that we introduced it was um, we've always had this theory that your change
Mhm.
failure rate is kind of a proxy for how much rework does your team have to do.
Mhm.
Because that rework is one, rework doesn't sound like fun. Who wants to go rework something? And second, it's usually not planned. I've never really seen a project plan that says, all right, on day X, we're going to deploy this thing. On day X plus 3 hours, we're going to roll it back. And then on day Y, we're going to push forward the next, like the proper release. Like no one plans for
Exactly.
that rework, right?
Exactly.
So, so in 2024, we introduced another metric called rework rate, both to prove out our theory that change failure rate is a proxy for your rework rate, and also to give you a better or another stability metric. And what we found was, in fact, they are very, very tightly related. And the question that we ask in the survey is, if you look at your previous deployments over the last N time period, how
Mhm.
many of those deployments were done how many of those deployments were unplanned deployments? So they were done in order to fix a software delivery problem. And so we see that number there coming together. And then I guess the final thing I'll say about these is we look at throughput and stability. Certainly 10 years ago, and in some areas still today, there is a belief that those two are trade-offs of one another. As a
Mm.
team, either we can be fast or we can be
Mhm.
stable. Like manager, pick one. Executive, pick one. Which do you want us to be, fast or stable? But
Mhm.
what our data shows us is that, and this data has held for the decade plus of the research program, is that those two concepts typically move together. So the teams that we see with the highest performance have great throughput numbers and great stability numbers. The teams we see with the lowest performance have low stability numbers and low throughput numbers. And excuse me, on the surface, like that may seem a little bit counterintuitive. But Dadisi, think about this. If you do anything, it doesn't matter what it is, if it's shipping software, driving a car, riding a bike, if you do it once a year, I can almost guarantee you're not going to be very good at it. Right.
Mhm.
And so if you're shipping software once a year or twice a year, I can almost guarantee that that deployment is going to go off the rails.
Mhm.
So throughput and stability are not trade-offs of one another. Oh, excuse me, one second. Oh, all this
No,
thinking
it's a great monologue. I love it. I love it.
gets
Yeah.
me all choked up, walking down memory lane. So throughput and stability are not trade-offs of one another. These metrics help us measure software delivery performance, which I like to talk about it as the center of gravity of
Mhm.
DORA's research. And as a team, a cross-functional team responsible for any one application or service, the
Mhm.
cross-functional team has to have shared joint ownership for those metrics
Yeah.
so that we show up and do the right things at the end of the day for our customers.
Yes.
Who's using our software? That's who we're here to serve.
Okay. So I'm going to take you all the way back to the beginning of the share, and I just wanted to ask you about. You mentioned in the very beginning that there was a difference between um, performance for the organization and the individual, and that you're looking at the individual developer experience as well as the platform or organizational impact as well. Like, how are you using those metrics or this research to kind of differentiate between where these things intermingle, where how do we improve developer experience but also improve the how that works for an organization. They seem almost counterintuitive, right? What's going to keep
Yeah,
the developers happy might not necessarily work for your platform.
yeah, I think that's a really good question. Thanks for that one, DC. So I think it's again sort of, and the way that we do all of our research, we kind of start with a hypothesis, right? And then we
Mhm.
kind of go try to prove or disprove that hypothesis, gather data that will give us
Mhm.
insights into that. And I think that the underlying hypothesis there is twofold, right? So first, on the organizational performance side, we have a hypothesis that organizations that are able to ship software faster and safer, they're going to have better organizational outcomes. Things like, measurable outcomes, things like profit, revenue, market share, things like that, and maybe less tangible outcomes as well, customer satisfaction, something along those lines, right? And what we've seen in the data is that is in fact the case. In fact, in one of the very early studies, I think this was like 2015-ish, 2014
Mhm.
or 2015 in the study. One of the things that they asked survey participants to provide, if you work at a public company, give us the stock ticker for that company. And then they did some analysis, and what they found was that the organizations that reported higher software delivery performance had something like 3 times the market share growth over the last 3 years of those that had slower software delivery performance. So that was a clear connection. And my exact numbers, it might not have been 3 times. Like, don't quote me on those. Go read the paper. But we showed that clear connection. So that's really important. But our other hypothesis is that happy people that are engaged in their work, people that find their work meaningful and fulfilling, they have higher job satisfaction and so forth, they tend to build better products and work better together. And at the very foundation of all of this is people, right? Even in today's world, we are certainly entering the AI era, but people are still the ones that build software, maybe with or without an AI assistant, but it's people that, are using the software that we're building for and that are building that software and collaborating within an enterprise in order to bring that software to life. And so we also want to test that hypothesis. Is that true? And what we find is that teams and individuals that are on teams where job satisfaction is higher, burnout is lower, employee engagement higher. In the study over the years, we've asked things like ENPS, or Employee Net Promoter Score. And net promoter score questions, right?
Mhm.
Hey, Dadisi, would you recommend that a friend or colleague work at the same company as you, like, or
Mhm.
on the same team as you? And those are good signals to understand, yes, the teams that are having those better well-being outcomes are also working in organizations that have better organizational outcomes on the whole.
Yeah. Okay. And I just like the way that the question is worded, where you're not saying, are you happy? You're saying, would you recommend it, right? There are other signals, clear signals for happiness. And it's very,
Absolutely.
very reassuring when I look at the report that you're using those kind of practices. You're not just saying, are you happy with your job? You're saying, show me. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and
Um,
if I may, just for a quick second
mhm.
here, since you've mentioned the questions, right? Let me just show you something really
Of
quickly,
course.
because one of the way that we gather data is we run an annual survey, and I'm over here on Dora.dev, and I'm just going to pop to research and then look at 2024. This is where we publish our latest research. But one of the things that we also publish are the questions that we ask in our survey. And this is really important because we might talk about something like like burnout or code complexity. Let's take burnout here as an example. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I know what burnout is and I know what that means. But your understanding of that particular thing might be slightly different to how we gathered our data. And we want to share exactly how we gathered our data for a number of reasons. But first, to help you understand, what do we mean when we say burnout? And for that one, as you can see here, we ask this question, or it's not really a question, we put a statement in front of you and ask you, how much do you agree or disagree, or to what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? I'm indifferent or cynical about my work. I feel burned out from my work. I feel like I'm ineffective at my work. My feelings about work negatively affect my life outside of work. This is how we get to signal around burnout. And so just knowing that those questions are there is helpful as you're reading the report to understand, well, how did they assess that? But the other reason it's helpful is you might want to assess this on your own team or within your own organization. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I've learned over the years with DORA is writing good surveys and good survey questions that give you the signal that you're looking for is very difficult. So I encourage you to leverage, liberate, steal, borrow some of these questions, because we've done a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Before we put them into our survey, we do usability testing with questions, if you can believe that. Like, we do usability testing to make sure that the question is clear, that you understand what we're asking, and the way you understand it is how we meant it to go. Like,
Mhm.
we do a lot of that vetting for you. So
Okay.
use
Well,
those.
that begs another question then, because you talked earlier about forming these hypotheses, right?
Yes.
And so clearly they're coming from somewhere. I'm assuming, and this is the part where I'm going to ask you for clarity. I'm assuming that leads to like how we're forming these questions. But how do you go about one, forming the hypothesis and evaluating which questions are going to let you find out whether that's happening, to get the proof for those hypotheses? How is that done?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it starts with people like you and me, practitioners in the space. And I want to be very clear, I'm a practitioner. I'm not a researcher. I work very closely with the researchers, but my history and sort of my background is in system administration and software development. It is not in R and doing data analysis. Like I work with researchers that help with that. And so the researchers are the ones that have taught me so much about how to write better survey questions and so forth. But they lean on us, the subject matter experts, if you will, the practitioners in the world, to come help us come up with these hypotheses. And one of the ways that we do that is, we sit down kind of collectively at the beginning and we think about, well, what outcomes actually matter? What are the things that we're driving towards? And that's where we get to things like well-being and organizational performance and so forth. And then we think about, well, what's the universe that we're kind of, or our center of gravity, as I call it, right? It's around software delivery performance. We've seen that drives those outcomes. Let's validate that. And then how do we improve software delivery performance? Well, let's come up with some hypotheses. We think that happier teams. We think that faster feedback is important in order to ship software. Well, how do you get faster feedback? That's not something you can just go ask about. Well, you get faster feedback through practices like automated testing and continuous integration. So let's go come up with questions that help us assess how are your continuous integration practices? How are your testing practices? And so that group of subject matter experts is very local to the DORA team, but then we lean on the industry. We take a look, like we're practitioners in the industry. We know what's happening. We keep our sort of finger on the pulse of the industry, if you will. And then even a little bit beyond that, we have at Dora.community, we have, well, as it says on the tin, a community of practitioners and researchers and leaders around the world that are thinking about these particular topics. And we take feedback from them and gain insights from them through regular meetings and so forth. We partner with folks like the CD Foundation and have conversations like this where we can now start to draw more hypotheses.
Right. Oh, excellent. Excellent. So as a tool builder and a like yourself, I am a builder of tools and very, very passionate about this space. I think one of the challenges that I have with the DORA research and then turning this into something useful internally or for other teams that I talk to is a lot of the data here is surveyed, right? And you're
Yes.
asking questions about the data, but when you go and you start talking to the actual people who want to do that, the engineering managers, they want hard data and making that transition from things that are surveyed to the hard data. When you're sitting down with your customers that you're going to do this research with,
Yeah.
how do you help them understand what is the important data to collect and how to ignore the false positives, things like vulnerability updates that will show up as something that is, hey, we had to make this change. And if you're using like a platform or something like an IDP, you don't necessarily know that that's not a change that is an impact of the software that you deploy, but it might be like a container vulnerability. And someone might say, oh, no, but we had to redo it because we got this PR and
Right.
it said we were doing something wrong. Are they collecting? Like, how do you help them understand these nuances?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And just to sort of piggyback immediately on the end of that question, how do you help them with those nuances, right? I think the way that we help them is first by starting and saying, look, Dora's job and the way that we run our research is to go and get a pulse of the world, right? We open up this survey and get responses from organizations of every shape and size in every industry vertical, from financial services to healthcare to government to technology startups to retail companies. They're all in there. And our findings kind of look at the world writ large, right? But the truth is, Dadisi, you don't work for the world. You work in the world, but in the world, you work in an organization. And in that organization, you work on a team, and that team is responsible for a specific set of applications. That context is super important. And so you have to, and the thing that we recommend is you take our findings and use those as your own hypotheses. Hey, Dora said, or Dora found that better testing automation leads to better software delivery performance, leads to better organizational performance. So I have a hypothesis. If we improve our test automation, we're going to see improvements in our software delivery performance. Let's go test that hypothesis. We can test that hypothesis now by collecting metrics. And I think it's important to remember that, and this is, again, back to the foundational principles of DORA, it's people first. right? It's people that are writing the test automation. It's people that are building the applications. And so I think it's really important that you have internally on your team and within your organization a mix of both telemetry that you pull from your systems
Mhm.
and telemetry that you pull from your people, right? And so I think mixing both survey data
Mhm.
and hard data, and
Mhm.
don't get me started. Survey data is hard data. Like that's real data. Just because someone said it doesn't make it not real data. It's actually real data still, right? But blending those two things together, I think, is really important. And then in terms of like which ones should you look at? That is a really good question as well. And I'm just going to pull up my screen here again really quickly, because one of the things that we've done over the years then is we've created this core model around
Mhm.
all of DORA's research findings. And here you'll find software delivery performance right there in the center, right? Our center of gravity leading to those outcomes. How do you get better at that? It's through these capabilities and conditions. At a very high level, we talk about them as a climate for learning, having fast flow and getting fast feedback. But we can look at these in a bit more detail and see that a climate for learning includes things like code maintainability, documentation quality, good culture on your team. Fast flow is continuous delivery and loosely coupled teams, fast feedback, continuous integration, test automation, and so forth. So one of the things that we do is say, look, the way that you're going to improve this software delivery performance is by focusing on some of these capabilities. There are too many here for you to focus on. So let's do a quick assessment to try to identify where's the bottleneck, which of these capabilities is kind of holding your team back. And the best way to get that quick assessment done, quite frankly, in my experience, is to gather the team together and have a conversation. Because most teams can tell you immediately, without any data, where it hurts. And
Mhm.
that's not without any data. That's with their lived experience, which again is real data, right? They know
Mhm.
what hurts and what they would change if they could. So start there. And then once you've picked a capability or two capabilities, now we can think about how are we going to get some measures out of that. And to get measures out of that, let's say it's continuous integration as an example, you can do a couple of things. One, you can just run a survey like we've done, and you can leverage our continuous integration questions. But the other thing you can do from a DORA perspective, for each one of those capabilities, we have a little article that talks about that particular capability, but also provides some insights in how can you measure that. So you want to understand how your continuous integration is going. You need to understand how many code commits or what percentage of code commits result in an automated build of the software. Are automated test results available regularly to your team and so forth? So now you can start to come up with what are some of those metrics. Now, once you've come up with ideas about what some of those metrics, now we get into the even more difficult question about metrics is how much time do we need to invest in gathering those metrics? And the truth
Yes.
is, you want to leverage things that are out there already. If you have data, telemetry that's easily accessible, use that. If you don't, use a framework, something like CDEvents that you can start instrumenting your systems with that can provide really great insights. And potentially you already have an SEI tool in place, SEI for Software Engineering Insights. There are a bunch of them out there. Here's some of
Mhm.
them that are out there. All of these capture those software delivery performance metrics as well as other metrics. And this is by no means a comprehensive list. So you may
Mhm.
already have tooling in place that can help guide that journey.
Awesome. Awesome. Again, I am super excited to be here. This is you talked about CD events and what it can do. That's definitely something that we here at the Continuous Delivery Foundation are working to improve and leverage and help our own customers leverage CD events to kind of collect some of this information and starting to think about um, how you can make platform accessible, piece by piece, right? You want to be able to just take the tools that you have and use something to get standardized data so you can begin to collect this information.
Yes.
But part of our challenge, or at least the challenge that I have with the implementation in this, is that we're talking to teams that don't yet leverage CD events. I'm finding in these conversations that they're a little confused about how to pull that data together and who to talk to. And I think having this information about the starting point and saying, hey, pick this one thing or pick these, two things and start there is a really, really great concept. And starting with what they already know, I mean, that's a eureka moment, right? Because you want to leverage that beginning, but to really start to say, how are we going to attack this problem and what do we want to improve? So that's wonderful that we're able to create those kinds of pairing of information with the hypothesis and find a solution to that problem. Um, which also
Yeah, to
made me
that
lose my
end,
next question. Yeah.
yeah. Well, to that end, I think that that also kind of demonstrates, at least to an extent, some of the fractal nature of what DORA finds, right? As an example, how do you improve software delivery performance? Well, one of the key lessons that we have is ship in smaller batches and limit the amount of work you have in process. Well, how do you start gathering metrics and get the better telemetry? Well, start small and do one thing at a time and like finish that thing. Don't go try to boil the ocean, right? Don't let the top precision, complete coverage of metrics be the thing that stops you from making a decision, be the thing that stops
Great
you
point.
from
Great
making a
point.
change, right? And unfortunately I've worked with teams who have said, well, once we have the dashboard, then we'll know what we need to change. And they've spent
Yes.
literally, I've seen teams spend 2 years perfecting the dashboard and then deciding how they want to start improving. At the end of the day, these metrics are here to start a conversation, and that conversation should lead to improvements for the team. DORA's tagline is get better at getting better. It's not get better at doing research. It's not get better at creating dashboards. It's get better at getting better, because we're on a journey of continuous improvement. And we just need to take one step forward today.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, we'll worry about the next step.
I think out of all of the things that you said, probably the most impactful to me personally is taking that first step and kind of stepping back and looking at the problem. I know that in a lot of the organizations that I work with and talk to, we are having these conversations like it's all or nothing, right? And
Yeah.
being able to create these windows is huge, and it's really just changed the way that I'm thinking about this problem. But the other portion of this that we haven't talked about is the influx of AI into this process and how it's impacting users and developers and customers, right? This is beginning to be seen and used in different ways, but how are you helping companies figure out how to do that effectively in their process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, this is one of the things that we researched in our latest research study. That research was published towards the end of 2024, and we looked at exactly that. What is the impact of AI? And at a very high level, we're seeing greater adoption of AI. So that's a good signal that at the practitioner level, AI is coming in and being used more and more across the industry. We also see high levels, much higher levels of AI prioritization. So, asking questions like, is your organization, or to what extent is your organization prioritizing AI? And we're seeing huge numbers. I think it was something like 80%, approaching 80% of the people that we surveyed, their organizations were putting a heavy emphasis from a prioritization standpoint on integrating AI into what they're doing. So this tells me that both at the top end, like from the top down, and at the grassroots, from the practitioner up, AI is making its way into our organizations. So then we also wanted to understand, well, what's the impact of that? How is that impacting folks? And we saw some really interesting, we had some really interesting findings there. If we start sort of at the practitioner level, what's happening to the practitioner? Well, job satisfaction, productivity, these are all going up. They're all improving when you're using
Yeah.
AI. And that makes sense. Well, first, it makes sense that they would tend to go together. Productivity and job satisfaction tend to move
Yes.
together, right? They tend to be pretty well correlated. But it's also the case that, we're engineers, Dadisi, and there's new tools to play with. That's what I love as an engineer. AI is one of those new tools. So if I'm working in an organization that allows me to get my hands on some of that new tech and play with it, I'm
Yeah.
obviously, maybe not obviously, but I'm oftentimes going to feel more engaged in the work that I'm doing, because that's
Yeah.
exciting and it's
You want
fun.
to be first to play with the tool.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, so we're seeing some really good impacts there.
Mhm.
If we step out and look at sort of the application level or process level, we're seeing things like documentation quality improve. And documentation quality is another really fascinating thing that we've been researching for the past 4 years, and just
Mhm.
the power and the impacts that documentation quality can have. We all knew it in our gut. And also as engineers, like, we don't like writing
Mhm.
documentation. We know it's important, but we don't want to do it. Well, we have data from DORA now that shows us just how powerful good quality internal documentation is. I'm not even talking about end user documentation, like
Right.
internal documentation, super powerful. And with AI, we're seeing that documentation quality improve. We're seeing code complexity go down as well, which of course is the correct direction for code complexity, right? We want
Mhm.
that to go down. So we're seeing some really interesting things there. So taken together, those two sort of paint a pretty optimistic, positive picture. But when we look at some of the outcomes, software delivery performance being one of those outcomes, right? We actually see that faltering as you're increasing your AI adoption. And our
Interesting.
data can't exactly tell us why, but I'll give you my leading hypothesis is that we as an industry are spending a lot of time and energy right now figuring out how can we use AI to generate code.
Mhm. Mhm.
And when it comes to software delivery, getting code into the hands of your users, the amount of time and the effort that it takes to generate that code is rarely, if ever, the bottleneck, right? And so what
Interesting.
we've done potentially is we've added more code to the system that we want to change, that we want to ship to users. And when you add more to the thing that's not the bottleneck, we should expect that the bottleneck is going to get even worse, right? That overall
Yeah.
performance is going to drop. Now, I think, and maybe this is just my, optimism shining through here, but I think we can end that statement like software delivery performance is faltering, comma, for now,
Mhm.
or AI isn't improving it yet. And
Mhm.
I think what it's really pointing to is an opportunity for us to think more broadly about how we're using AI. Can we use it? Certainly some
Yes.
people are using it to generate tests, but let's use it to think about how do we get faster feedback? How do we
Yes.
get it? How do we use it throughout that delivery process, right? Through code reviews, through automated testing, integration testing, all of that, like building out automation for us. There are lots of opportunities that I think are underexplored at the moment.
Yes.
And so I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic. There's certainly lots of reasons to be cautious as well. But
Yes, yes. Yeah, I think as a tool builder, one of the things that I'm often thinking about, especially with AI, is how can I use AI and the process of just analyzing data to give better outcomes for those people using the tools. I know that that is a big gap right now in the CI/CD space. It is one that we're hoping to kind
Mhm.
of close in the future. And again, CDEvents is being able to give a flat, use case for analyzing data. If everything's a CD event, it should be a lot easier to analyze your data and use AI to do that. And that's really, really important to how we're looking at the problem in the CDF and how we'd like to solve it long term. But it does tie back to how are people using it and what are their expectations. And this is one of the things that I really like about this year's report and how it talked about AI usage, right? You're really talking about how this impacts the individual, and that individual impact is really still where we're trying to get to. If we're making these changes and you're saying, hey, let's research this thing and make this improvement. So again, how you're talking about start with one thing ties really well to the AI story and how it's moving forward. And wow, it's amazing. Again, I'm still going to be fanboying about being able to talk to you, Nathan. I'm super
Hey,
excited.
hey, Dadisi, I have a question. I have a question for you. I
Okay.
suppose that's allowed, right?
Hmm.
Look, I know that many people in the CD Foundation are well versed in what CD events are, but maybe some of the folks that are here watching us now aren't.
Oh,
Can you give us like
thank you
the
for that.
the
That is,
overview of CD
yes,
events?
yes, yes. CD Events was born out of, well, it was born in the CDF interoperability SIG. The goal here was how do we standardize on the language of CI/CD? That if we had one language that CI/CD could speak, then that standardization would allow for better tools or some opportunity for interoperability. And what we've done is we've taken a look at each individual tool in the SDLC workflow. And that would include starting with when you create the project and you make a ticket. And, that moves on to like deploy, you create the repositories, you put that into your SEM. Each one of these things are events in the chain that we want to collect so that you can analyze. And we here at the CDF are working as a group to kind of say, hey, what's the standardization of that language? What are the things that we need to be in common to build these tools and understand this process end to end? And we are at a point now where we're beginning to talk about, well, okay, we've got this event representation for CI, CD. How do we put this into tools in a common way? And that draws us all the way back to the beginning, to the research that you're doing, because it's intent. And one of the things that you're doing with the surveys that I really, really appreciate is you're talking about the why. Why are people doing things? And the difference between a CI build and a CI build and publish, those are really different kind of things. Sometimes you just want to run some tests. Sometimes you need to do a deploy. And so the intent of why you're doing a thing becomes how we map those events to SDLC workflows. And hopefully, with where we're trying to go with this, we can line that up with some of these things like, okay, I need to do a rollback because, the deployment didn't work, but there is a pipeline that you can use and CDEvents that will represent that, and you can collect that information and move forward. We are really looking at your process and the things that you are trying to research and understand, and then translate that into some of that hard data that a lot of those engineering managers are asking for, right? A lot of the executives want to understand, but we are also cautioning as we do this to, look, you really need to understand the DORA process and that research and what they're trying to accomplish out of it. And now from this conversation, we can extend that and say, hey, you can pick a place to start. And this is how we can, do this with CDEvents to help you get the data that you need. But it's got to be impactful and useful to the individual. And that's one of the things that keep me up at night. Like if we're providing all of this data, how is that going to help the individual developer experience and improve their life and the quality of their being as they do their jobs, because it is being able to play with the new tools. It is being able to use the new cool thing, and we like to see CDEvents be that as well.
Yeah. Oh,
Great
that's
question.
that's super awesome. And I think that again, like having sort of that consistent way of both the vocabulary being consistent, but also the way that you're gathering that telemetry be consistent, even within a single organization, right? That unlocks so many great conversations and decisions that you can make. I also think it's really important there. We both care about what is the individual user experience like? What is that
Yes.
developer experience like?
Yes.
But I don't think either of us are really advocating for metrics that are measuring the individuals, because I
Yes.
believe that we both we know that delivering software, building, delivering, operating software technology of any kind, that is not an individual sport, that's a team sport, right?
Yes. Yes.
And you really need to look at the system, the team, the tools, the entire sort of socio-technical system, if you will, that comes together to create that. That's where you're going to make decisions, and that's how you're going to drive things. This is not about measuring individual developers, because that's a webinar for another time.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that is the thing that I appreciate most about the way that you approach this research, that it isn't about how do I make this person do a thing, right? It's how do we understand what's going on to improve the process, and it's always we.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate the community approach that Dora's taken, that you can go talk to the community and get feedback and get information, and keeping it about, what you're trying to fix, not making it about any individual behaviors. And I think that's a wonderful thing that the way that you guys have done that.
Great.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, this is, and I hate to say this one more time. So glad you're here, Nathen. So glad you're here.
Well, I'm certainly glad to be here. This is a really fun conversation, and I appreciate the work that's happening with the CD Foundation, especially around CDEvents, and that I think it's really driving, and has I think in both cases, frankly, there's a lot of unlocked potential that's
Yes.
still out there. I think the road is bright for both of these projects.
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here then. Like, how can we, DORA and the CDF kind of work better to ensure that, what we're doing with CDEvents aligns as best as we can with the research that you plan to be doing in the future. Like I said, you added a new key measure. And I thought that was great, by the way. And I appreciate the fact that you mentioned that earlier because that was going to be one of my questions.
Oh,
But
right.
like, how do we line up with the direction of where you want to go? That's the conversation that I would like to keep going and like, make some commitment to doing that because I think that we have an opportunity to extend what you're trying to do or what you've
Mhm.
already done in a way that might be useful to everyone, right? Because it's not about the individuals and it's also about how do we get this information or this usefulness into some of the smaller organizations, right? Because when we when I look at DORA and its capabilities, I usually think enterprise, right? Because the impact on enterprise and
Right.
the adoptions on the enterprise level has been huge. But how do we get it to some of the smaller companies that are just starting out that really need to understand how they can, hit the ground running and come out of the box accomplishing things? How do we use CDEvents to create platforms where we're talking about disparate tools that we want to bring together? Like that's part of what CDEvents is about. I
Mhm.
want to give this information to everybody. I want everyone to be able to be able to participate in the DORA experience. And that was always something personal for me, but that's why I'm fanboarding that you're here. So
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of commitments, I think there's a couple of things, right? First, as I mentioned earlier, we have the DORA community. We get together in the community for regular discussions. So, Dadisi, you should come talk with the DORA community about CD events. Like that is a
okay.
concrete next step that we can take. It's small, it's within our control,
Yep.
and we can see real impacts coming out of that. So, like to
Yep.
me, that feels like an obvious thing. And then
All
I
right.
I think further down the line, right? Us as researchers and as builders of CD events, maybe having a sort of a summit or something where we get together and we like share
Yes.
these ideas with one another. And I think the Dora community is the best place for us to start that or to continue this conversation because well, it's also true that we aren't starting from zero, right? We're
Right.
here today. We've known each other for a while and we're going to keep this going.
Awesome. Awesome. Let's see. I think I, I I actually don't have any more questions. I'm just happy to be sitting here. But
All right.
so just out of curiosity though, what's next for DORA research? Like I said, you added a new metric.
Yep.
Is there more metrics coming? Is there, what's next in the research line for DORA?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm happy to say that one of the things that we're doing since publishing the last report and will be a theme for us throughout the year, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say that it's kind of a new thing. We're taking a little bit of our own advice.
Hmm.
One of the things that we've learned over the years is the best way to improve your software delivery performance is to ship smaller batches and to do
Hmm.
so more frequently. DORA has a history of publishing an annual report, right?
Hmm.
So how do we get to a state where we can release research more frequently than annually? One,
Hmm.
it's changing some of our research methods, right? We love doing broad-based surveys and getting as many participants as we can in those. But if we were to go from, say, an annual broad-based survey
Hmm.
to monthly broad-based surveys, what we're going to see over time is our completion rates are just going to dwindle, right? Because yes, I'll complete a survey for you once a year, but asking me to do that on a more
Right.
frequent basis, that becomes difficult. So we have to, as researchers, we're finding new pathways that allow us to do more frequent research. Um, and at the same time, like we don't want to get rid of the annual survey. And frankly, between you and me, I think that the survey we publish every year is at least maybe even more impactful or can be than the report. And here's why I
Interesting.
say that. If you're an individual or a leader working in an
Mhm.
organization, right? Whether you're an individual contributor or a leader, if you sit down and take the survey, the questions that we ask, if you think critically about them, by the end of the survey, you're going to have ideas on where you can improve right now.
Mhm.
You don't need to
Mhm.
wait for our publication to come out. You can go start getting better right now. And so I think that that careful consideration of the questions and the fact that we publish the questions, those are two huge contributions that we're making to help teams get better. So I think that's really important. But so what does it look like to ship more research more frequently? Well, again, we're leaning into what everyone else is leaning into right now, and that's AI. And so again, I'll just come back to the research page here. You see our 2024 research. We've just recently added new articles about artificial intelligence. And
Mhm.
these three articles, helping developers adopt generative AI, how Gen AI affects the value of development work, and fostering developers' trust in generative AI. All of these have been published since the report. Some of them are in response to what we're hearing from the community. Some of them are deeper dives into questions that were we were left with unsatisfactory answers based on the initial survey data collection. So we augmented those further. And so now we're shipping on a more, I don't want to call it a regular cadence, but a more
Mhm.
frequent cadence. We're shipping out small nuggets of research. And I think that's really important. Another thing that we're looking to do this year with our research is to set up something that is more akin to a longitudinal study. And what I mean by longitudinal study is, look, we've got 10 years of research, right?
Mhm.
10 years of reports, but every year that report is fully anonymous. So from
Mhm.
one year to the next, I can't tell you, is it Dadisi who answered the questions both years? And how has Dadisi's experience changed over that year? I can't
Mhm.
answer that. With a longitudinal study, we'll have more insight into who the practitioners or the participants in our surveys are or our
Mhm.
studies are, and we'll be able to see and sort of track them over time. Oh, here's how these particular capabilities are improving or faltering, and here's the impact on org performance and well-being and software delivery performance and so forth. So I'm really excited about that. And then the third thing that we started in 2024, in
Mhm.
addition to using surveys to collect our data, we now have a more qualitative focused researcher on the team who sits
Mhm.
down and does deep interviews with practitioners. These interviews really help us build out a little bit more context and sort of understanding of some of the signals that we see in our survey data. We can then sit down and have an hour-long conversation to get sort of on-the-ground experience to help us, again, like I said, form that context around that, get
Yeah.
better qualitative insights into what we're seeing in the survey data.
Okay.
So those are some of the things that we're really excited about to do. Of course, the thing I'm most excited about is the conversations that we have with the DORA community, because at
Mhm.
the end of the day, that community, the practitioners, the people that are putting this research into practice, they're the experts. And as a community, we get to learn from each other throughout the year. That's super exciting.
So, just out of curiosity, in the report itself, it talked about teams or organizations that had their own platform engineering
Yes.
team. And I think it found that that was actually pretty useful if you have your own platform engineering team. Have you, as a group, like, is there some specialized set of data for these teams? Are there specialized conversation? Are there different questions when you're talking to these groups? Like, how are you interacting or positioning, the things that are coming and the changes that you're making for these teams that are actually trying to take action against it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And platform engineering, like AI, was one of the topics that we looked into in our most recent study. Platform engineering is interesting because in some ways it's similar to DevOps in the worst ways, right? And here's the way that it's the worst. In our survey, we can't ask, does your team do DevOps? Right? Because what does that even mean? Right? And certainly, regardless of whether the answer is yes or no, it's not consistent from one organization to the next, right?
Yeah.
And so we have that exact same challenge with platform engineering. Does your team do platform engineering, or does your organization have a platform engineering team? Neither one of these are good signals into, are you approaching and building out a platform?
Yeah.
So the first thing that we had to do this year was define, what did we mean by a platform? And we gave a very broad definition in the survey. We said, look, a platform is like a shared set of capabilities, and maybe tools, but certainly capabilities. A platform team is not required. Like, you don't have to have a team that's called the platform engineering team in order to have a platform in place. But then we wanted to look at those teams that do, and the questions that we asked, of course, are published over on Dora.dev, so you can go reference them there. But you can then look at, well, in the organizations, first, which organizations have platform teams?
Mhm.
And in a surprise to probably no one, larger organizations, platforms, smaller organizations, lower chance of having platforms. Makes
Yeah.
perfect sense, right? Platforms are a great way to scale some of those capabilities and have shared components and so forth, right? So, so we also want to understand like what's the impact, right? And we see again, we see good impacts on the individuals that are working either on the platform team or in applications that are riding on top of that platform, right? And I think the good impacts can all be kind of summarized into you have less sort of context that you need to maintain in your mind, right?
Right.
The cognitive overload, if you will, is much lower if you can stay focused. I'm focused on building this application. I know that there are guardrails and safeties that will help me get this application to production. Or I'm focused on building the platform that's going to help all of those apps. I don't need to worry about the applications, just the platform that's here. And so by
Yeah.
sort of constraining that is very helpful. Now, interestingly, we did see that having a platform in place is not really predictive of better software delivery performance. In fact,
Hmm.
today it's a little bit predictive of maybe worse software delivery performance. And again, this is something that we need to, as a community, learn more about. We don't,
Right.
our data doesn't really tell us why. One hypothesis, though, that we have is that, look, organizations put a platform in place. Oftentimes the motivation is not to improve software delivery performance. The
Yes.
motivation is to improve consistency across
Yes.
all of the applications that we have here, improve the leverage that we're getting out of some of our technology and investments. And maybe that doesn't lead to better software delivery performance. Again, comma yet? Question mark? I don't know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
maybe it's just not there yet. And maybe as these platforms mature, there will be a better emphasis and focus on that software delivery performance. So I think,
Yes.
as always, it's exciting times ahead in technology, and it's not a static space. There are always opportunities to learn more and try new things.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll add is one of the problems that we're trying to solve with CDEvents is how do we integrate new things into a platform? How do you create space for things that you don't know about yet? And then
Yes.
how do you take in like other process like data ops and your AI ops and things like that? How do you bring that all together? Because what I am finding as I talk to customers and clients and community members is that their challenge is that when they're trying to build their IDP or their platforms, every team does things a little bit differently.
Yes.
And so you're trying to move everyone into this new format and make changes to their process. And that brings its own set of problems and challenges. So I would suspect that some of that is also impacting that number. Trying to change all of your process to fit into this square peg when you're a circle doesn't necessarily work. And it'd
Totally.
be
That's
interesting.
those are some of the ways that we kind of looked at it. One of
Yeah.
the sort of concepts that we looked at for platform engineering was how, as a team that's utilizing the platform, how independent are you? Do you rely on the platform team to help you out in order to get
Yes.
anything done? And we also looked at exclusivity. Okay, the only way for me to do anything is on top of the platform.
Yeah.
If that's the case, like you should expect that the platform probably doesn't have all of the capabilities that you need from day one.
Yes.
Right. And so if you're forced to use it, of course, that's going to slow you down and cause friction.
Yes.
And so there's some really interesting dynamics there to
Yes.
investigate and for us all to learn and consider and improve on.
Yes, yes, yes. It will be great when every platform is open and connected, right? That
Yes.
would really help. Yeah. All right. So we're at time, but I will say that I really would enjoy, continuing conversations with you. I hope you don't mind me reaching out just to say hi. You're always welcome here at the Continuous Delivery Foundation. Nathan, it has been so, so nice talking to you today. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm looking forward to the next conversation, man. It's just awesome to see you.
Awesome. It's been really great. And I'm going to hold you to showing up for a
Oh
DORA
yeah, no, I'm
community,
there. Yeah.
DORA community session. And
Mhm.
we'll have another great conversation there and it'll be a lot of fun.
All right, awesome.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you
Awesome.
so much.
Thank you to DC.